Good afternoon, and welcome to today's session on the topic of advancing behavioral health analytics with integrated cloud services. This session will step through the journey the Commonwealth of Virginia has taken to implement a modern enterprise data warehouse to streamline data management, improve data quality, associate individuals across multiple health systems, and optimize outcomes reporting on critical programs serving our vulnerable populations. My name is Bryant Jenkins. I'm the engagement manager leading the implementation of the new EDW platform for the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. I'm joined on stage with three of our technology leaders from Virginia and Deloitte that helped make this transformation to a serverless, event-driven architecture possible. Bob Osmond, Russell Acacian, and Don Hogue. Gentlemen, could you please each introduce yourselves?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Bob Osmond. I'm the Commonwealth CIO and the agency head for the Virginia IT Agency.
Good afternoon. Russell Acacian, the Chief Information Officer for the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. Great to be here.
I'm good. I got my mic, thanks. Don Hogue. I'm the Deloitte leader in digital health and also am the account manager associated with this project for Deloitte. And I did order the extra large room, but I guess we'll have to deal with what we got. So.
Thank you all. So now for today's agenda, we're going to begin with an overview of Virginia's IT footprint, followed by steps that VITA has taken to transition on-premise applications to the AWS cloud. Then we're going to spotlight the work that's been happening over within DBHDS specifically to rethink how data is collected, governed, and aggregated to support data-driven decisions related to behavioral and mental health programs.
Hey, Bryant, you need to advance the slide.
So states are funny entities. We're all different. If you look at, there's 50 of us, and everyone operates with a different type of model. Virginia is a mid-sized state. We're smaller than Texas, bigger than Rhode Island. We serve 8.7 million citizens, and as you can see, there's 67 different agencies that we directly work with. The breadth of the state in terms of Virginia recognizes the diversity of the respective missions. And so if you think about all the different things that a state does, we have entities that operate museums and cultural exhibits. We have groups that do public safety, like the state police. We have groups that operate, hospital systems. We have people that manage transportation. It really is a breadth of activities. We even have a spaceport. So when you look at all these different things, you see a lot of stuff. And, we operate in 1,700 different locations. We have a lot of data, a lot of different services that are offered. And that the work that we do at the state level follows four themes. One is the work around Commonwealth infrastructure, so the different things that people use to operate their IT systems for the agencies that we serve. We provide statewide unified cybersecurity. We do governance of all kinds of IT-related activities across the state, and then we do statewide procurement. Next slide. So the operating model that we have is what I call a shared operating model. It's very much based around the notion that at the enterprise, we standardize the infrastructure so that we can unify the different work that we do in terms of the platforms that we operate in, the network, the end-user compute devices, the data centers. Those are all common across the 67 different entities. We provide shared work in terms of the governance and the architecture and the cybersecurity. The work then, but that's happening at the data and the application layer, that was very much done by the agencies that we serve. And so this is what I call a decentralized model. And like I said, every state operates a little differently. At Virginia, this is how we operate, and it's a nice way to drive scale and standardization on things that lend itself to standardization, and also allows agencies that are closest to their mission to develop the unique solutions and capabilities that they need in order to deliver that mission as best possible. So we started our journey really back in 2018. That's when we got into the cloud officially. And I call that phase between 2018 to 2022 our fake cloud phase. And so we were in the cloud technically, but we were using the cloud really as if it was a private data center. So we were using EC2 clusters, we were using storage, but we weren't really taking advantage of it. We were treating them as just another source of servers. That changed around 2022 when we started looking at the true opportunity of working in the cloud. And that's where we started looking at all the different serverless capabilities. We started looking at the value of how we can more fully embrace the public cloud and work together. And we started with AWS. There were a lot of reasons why we led with AWS. There's issues around, it was a function of maturity, it was a function around choice. For example, in the private cloud that Virginia had, we offered 50-ish different flavors of compute, different types of operating systems, different types of clusters. In the AWS cloud, we offered 450. And that number is growing and growing and growing. And even this morning, they announced even more different choice. And so that choice allowed us to think about cloud capabilities in a very different way. Instead of thinking about it from the perspective of a server that took you weeks to provision to a server that you can provision in 37 minutes, that's a very different mindset around capabilities. And now that we're looking at even different types of capabilities around serverless architectures and different types of capabilities in that way, we're finding that there's even a greater opportunity to accelerate value and time to deliver within the enterprise and build out capabilities, starting with the fine work being done by my colleague Russell.
So that's a great segue. Why don't we talk a little about what's happening over within DBHDS and the challenges that you faced when you came?
Perfect. So just to set a little context here, I probably spent about 25 years in the private sector, predominantly in the financial services and some in healthcare. I've been with the agency for about 2 years, so kind of brought in that private sector mentality. And one of the first things, that we looked at was, kind of just an agency topology, and really wanted to understand kind of where we were. And what we found was we had an antiquated architecture, and there's a lot of companies out there that have that. The problem that we really kind of ran into was everything in that public sector is done in silos. Everything is a funded project with no vision, no ability to look at, well, how do I want to build, components that, I can then continue to build on as I go. And so the first thing that we really wanted to do was begin to lay out kind of what we wanted architecturally, and that kind of started with the data. Everything starts with the data. And so we have 12 facilities. We've got 40 community service boards that support behavioral health throughout the state of Virginia, and then we've got thousands upon thousands of private sector supporters of behavioral health throughout the state of Virginia as well. And so where we're really trying to go is understanding that an individual can go to a facility, to a community service board, to a private, provider, but there was no data integration across the state to really understand how this individual was being serviced. And so this is where our enterprise data warehouse really began, was to start bringing all of this data in, building out, a master patient index where we could then begin to track, the progress of an individual through the state of Virginia. We had a lot of manual processes. It was hard to believe that data was days, weeks, months being delayed as you envision a clinician or a doctor, servicing somebody and then having to go in and manually enter something because systems weren't integrated. And so a lot of what we've been doing over the last 2 years, as we were building out the data warehouse, was beginning to build the integration layers in the cloud as well, so that as we begin to continue modernizing our technology, the hooks are there, the service bus is there, the data warehouse is there. So now we're at a position where we can now modernize the applications and continue to integrate and really begin to move all these manual processes away. Last and least was there was zero transparency into the data. Data quality across the board was truly lacking. It made it hard to do analytics to really understand where the state was, how they were moving in regards to behavioral health services. And so as we sit here today with millions of transactions flowing in, we've really progressed, the data analytic capabilities across the state of Virginia when it comes to behavioral health. And we're well positioned now to really modernize our technology and move forward. So it's been a great partnership. It was a great, advancement for the state of Virginia. And as you'll hear here later, we're kind of set up to now begin integrating, systems across sister agencies within the state, and that'll be something that'll be done for the first time as well.
That's good. Let's talk about the solution itself. Don, why don't you tell us a bit about what made this implementation of the data warehouse platform so novel for Virginia?
And I think Russell had alluded to it, and one of the things that Russell was very clear about in the beginning of this and as a part of the contracting activity was we don't want to just do things the same way that we currently do them. How do we expand? How do we get to real time? How do we get information in, more data, more accurate and complete data? And so that was kind of around three big pillars that I think about within the architecture itself was speed of information. Can we get APIs? Do we not just rely on managed file transfer, batch information, but can we create something that can connect to these community service boards? These community service boards, they use electronic health record platforms, and so integrating with them and allowing them to submit information real time, utilizing cloud capabilities to expose that, secure, and working through key transfer and key management so that all that information can flow very seamlessly. This was the first time that DBHDS would also get accurate and complete information at the point of care that was delivered for an individual. You can imagine all of the files become proprietary files, they're text files, they have to be submitted, they get corrupted, they don't have all the data in them, you have to resubmit them, maybe they get fixed, maybe they don't. This solution was to solve that not only by still enabling batch submission, but then also through a healthcare standard, the HL7 transaction. And we went through many different facets of the pieces for the discharge information, the admission information, like what has to all go into that so that those community service boards could give the department a complete and total picture running of everything that's happened to that person. You can imagine in the continuum of care, there are a number of things that happen. It's not just you go into a facility and you're done. There's many follow-ups that happen along that way. And then the third big piece of this was also federal compliance. So there are many federal reportings through SAMHSA and other organizations that are required to get out to what is happening. And it's given DBHDS now the opportunity to say, I have a better understanding of not only the care that's being delivered, but how much it's costing, how frequently it's being delivered, and we can start talking about getting proactive around that care as well going out in the future, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that. But how have we done that? Of course, we've been focused a lot on as much serverless technology as we can get to. We're trying to ingest real time. We're also using Glue for that data transparency so that we can go through and say, here is the metadata, here's the composition of the messages, here is the totality of the pieces that are coming in and what cycle that they come in, so that there is full lineage of what happens for every piece, every submission. We've also now begun ingesting from financial systems as well as incorporating master data management services. So we can start looking and saying, are these actually unique individuals? So we're running through an entity resolution services, some other verification functions within the platform so that we can identify uniquely each of those people and then say, are we seeing duplicates? Are we seeing rationalization around all of those folks? That gets us a lot to that longitudinal record view. So now I can say, not only today, but this month, this year, these last 3 years, what has happened to you in your entirety of care. And people can go through on the front end of the application, dive into that, they can drill down, they can see all the things that have happened. There's a very important aspect here around data quality. Russell had mentioned a bit about that as well as Bryant of saying, this transaction process, it still inherently has its own challenges. And so even though you get in a record actively, there may be issues with its submission that you want the community service board to fix. But they need to be able to log into something and see the front end and have a dashboard or something that's going to tell them, you've got 10 messages that failed today, or you have 3 data elements that we expected you to fill in that you did not. We're expecting you to now fix that, get real-time acknowledgments, and have those come back so it's not a month later that the data comes in or 6 months later if they get to it. There's sort of a running track record now for those community service boards to say, have you fixed all the things that we expected you to fix? Does all the things balance out now? 10 messages in, 8 errored out. That means there's 2 left you're still supposed to submit. Have you submitted all of those? And that running track record, that running logging process, as well as actively exposed to those community service boards. And they can see those things so that DBHDS not only has that transparency, but so do those active and accountable participants. There's certainly any number of things that we do around some data enrichment functions. There's any number of geocoding activities, some things that we do around the diagnosis codes and procedure codes that are used with those people at the point of care, things that we've had to coordinate and work directly with those community service boards on how is the method of how you're recording the care that is delivered, and is that consistent with how the program anticipates that that data is being delivered. So a lot of reference checks, verifications that happen in real time, and then any number of ingestion and integration into the wider data ecosystem that Russell wants to maintain within the department so that this particular EDW solution is also one of those supporting components within the larger enterprise data ecosystem and framework. So there's a number of certainly services, and of course there's compute, and there's various other things that go into that, and we can certainly get into any number of those things. But I think there's been an unprecedented amount of information that is now available to the department. There's some exciting things to come next about what they can start to do with that information now that they have it. If you can imagine, historically, the files that they got were actually also de-identified. So they didn't even know who those individuals per se were at they had like a unique identifier from that community service board. Other than that, they didn't have names, they didn't have anything else. So some of that security rolled into working with Bob's team of how do we make sure now that we have this accountability around the data, that we're protecting it correctly, and that we have everything signed and sealed off the way that it's supposed to be transmitted and supported and viewed by individuals. But there was a lot of paving the roadway. I think that I can probably go out on a limb and say that we were one of the first to really start laying the groundwork within this environment of how this could and should work, not only for DBHDS, but also with VITA and a lot of the surrounding partners.
So let's talk about teaming, right? This team, what made this team and collaboration so successful? Don, why don't you lead, but Russell, I'd like to hear from you after.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of even just sort of group conversations here around how are we going to set up the API structure? How is that going to feed into a common data ecosystem and framework that's going to be shared across applications? Many agile sessions was really a good focus for how we structured the team to say we're going to iterate and we're going to learn and we're going to review and do retrospectives and come back and have new sprints that are going to create different activities, starting with that base foundation of the data framework. And then from there, we were able to start progressing into like reporting and activity. So that was a lot of agency department support around data governance. What are the policies that need to be in place? Envisioning what that needs to look like, and then how security policies from VITA and team and others are going to mix into the structure and architecture. A lot of common design sessions to talk about what does the framework and the system solution need to look like so that it fits with the architectural plan, but then also the proposed solution that we had put forward. So a lot of very multidisciplinary team. We have a lot of folks who are very exposed to the federal compliance angle of things, people who are very data-focused people, a lot of technology and architecture people, AWS cloud-specific people, and it was definitely getting a lot of those people together and having a lot of good iterations, but then also solid deliverables of this is what we're putting forward, this is what we're recommending, is that, and then iteration from all of those people on we agree, we understand, this is where we're moving with that. Thoughts, Russell?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the collaboration was great, but it was something that was different from being in the private sector with, where you owned everything.
Right.
Because like you said, there was the Deloitte team, there was an AWS team, there's the VITA team. And then I brought on my chief enterprise architect, upon joining, the contract was kind of in flight as we joined. So a lot of the groundwork had been laid, and then we had to go through those iterations and the collaboration that you were talking about to really kind of, exploit the vision that we had in regards to what we wanted to do architecturally to really advance the agency. You talked about the real-time data integration. It was hard to believe that you had 12 facilities that each could have anywhere from 100 to 300 to 400 beds, and nobody knew what was going on.
Right.
And so being able to do bed management through admissions and discharge in real time, and while it sounds foolish to sit here and talk about it today, when you think about how money moves and everything else, that was eye-popping, but it was the result of everything being done in silos as a defined project. And so I think this was the first time, for our agency where there was a true collaborative negotiation around, all right, what is our vision and where do we really want to go? So that was, for me, it was a true appreciation for what Deloitte brought to the table, what our AWS partners brought, and then, without Vita, being there to support us along the way, we would not have, been able to get this program out the way we did, so.
And we did undertake an AWS review as well in multiple stages of the architecture, the proposed direction, and made sure we were bouncing things off of them of what we were doing and how they thought that lined up either with particular services. There was definitely a financial operations, a FinOps structure to this to say, does this match up to what our anticipated burn and budget was expected to be? And are there things that we have to adjust around how we're going to ingest data or how we utilize that information or those services to align with the budget and the plan? So there was a lot of kind of back and forth to make sure that all lined up that particular way. And then a lot of requests from like Bob's team of like, do we have the right access? Do we have the right people who have access? And do we know what those roles are supposed to be? And do we make sure that those roles are only using the things that they're supposed to use? So it was continues to be. We've gone live. We have had 2 of the phases completed so far. We are in production. We do have 2 more phases that are going with additional data sources and additional services that are coming through. So those are some more features to come up. But we continue to even iterate now and make sure that we're keeping and maintaining that spirit of learning from all the things that we're doing.
And so this journey, as we kind of lead into the panel discussion here, this journey was years in the making when we actually started with laying the infrastructure components, Bob, that your team and you helped lead to the implementation of the data warehouse itself. I think as we head into kind of the questions that I'm going to ask you here in this panel discussion, I think Bob, maybe this is to you first. Is from that initial vision, right? How did you get forward? What was the next step from the vision to making some forward progress to achieve that vision?
I think it starts with having a vision. I mean, having a leader in an agency like Russell to come in and bring in that background from the private sector and say that I have a different idea of how we should be operating. If you look at state government in general, it tends to be a little stale, and that and people know what they know. In many places within state government, people have been in position for 20, 30, 40 years. I had one person who hit 55 years, which is just incredible. And so they don't necessarily know what they don't know. And so you need to have people that come in to have an alternative view on how to accomplish the mission much more effectively, and they can serve as a catalyst to the enterprise to say, how do we do things differently? Because otherwise, for someone at my level who's trying to provide capabilities that are then consumed by the agencies, I'm innovating for the sake of innovating. I need a partner in the agencies who can lead the charge and really push ahead and say that there's a different alternative that we have to accomplish that mission. And so, we were really lucky to find that in Russell. So he brought that. That pushed us to then step forward and say, now how do we meet that demand signal that's now been given, and how do we work together in order to do it in a safe, effective, secure way, to really advance the state of the art forward.
Russell, what do you think about that? What was your experience like before entering state government, and how did that change when you did?
I kind of touched on it earlier. For the organizations that I managed in the private sector, you owned everything. So life was easy, in regards to the inter-organization collaboration. Innovating here was exciting for me because it was a new challenge, and it really started with changing the culture of thinking. Really working across multiple agencies and getting people to see things differently, to see how technology wasn't a burden but an enabler, and really kind of driving that home. And then really over the last 2 years, as we have moved so many workloads out to AWS, when everyone said you can't do that, that was the first thing when I joined, was everyone was like, well, you're not going to do that. And that's always been my challenge, is as soon as you tell me I can't do something, that's when we're going to get it done. And it's just around leading people down a path where you empower them, you teach them, you mentor them, and really it was, like I said, it was really around teaching people how to think differently, to drive that modernization, to help them see what they really wanted to see in the systems, because they've been doing it for so long that they had blinders on.
Yeah. And Bob, back to you. Any other points you'd have for other states or agencies that are looking at similar modernization goals? How do you get them started?
I think it's always hard to be first, and for someone to kind of break the ice, start moving forward. It seems, the cloud seems so scary in a lot of ways. I know this is fairly common, probably for a lot of people in the audience. They're probably well along their cloud journey. But when the state government, where people are used to operating a certain way, they have these internal barriers on reasons why they can't do it. And so this is where we look at agency leadership, enterprise leadership, industry leadership, from like Deloitte and others, to come in and say, there's a different way of getting this work done, and we're holding ourselves back. And so we need to step forward. And that's where leadership really comes in, to where leaders really know the way, they show the way, they go the way, and really don't accept no for an answer. You have to be stubborn. You have to say, hey, we're going to do this, and the fact of the matter is, and then once you accomplish it, then it's done, and then it's no longer a first of its kind within the state. It's something that is normal, and so we recreate that new normal. And then what's exciting is not just what's happening at DBHDS, at that agency, but it's what's happening around DBHDS. And this is other agencies, because we all talk, we're a pretty chatty bunch, the state agencies get together and we talk about each other quite a lot, and learning from each other and trying to say, hey, you know what, maybe I could try this too. Maybe that I'll take a risk and do something differently, and try to take advantage of some of these technologies. That maybe, the enterprise is not necessarily a challenge, that it is possible to innovate at scale. And once services have been approved, it's been secured, we've shown that pattern, that now we're just talking about replicating it, and then it becomes a little bit much more common. And then as you bring technologists together and they start looking at these ways, it becomes a lot more exciting. And because who really wants to do the same thing over and over again? This becomes a whole new area of innovation, and I think that's where the excitingness comes from in a lot of what we do.
Let's switch to tooling for a second. I know, Russell, we've had many discussions around the right tools and products to be applying in our implementation of the data warehouse, but kind of what were some of the things that drove you to make decisions around COTS versus SaaS versus custom and native services? Can you speak to that a bit?
I think, first and foremost, typically you look for those revenue differentiators. That's where your secret sauce is. Those are the things that you're going to kind of build on your own. Those things that, are just kind of standard across the industry. I know, we leveraged, Mirth to do a lot of our, data translation. Yeah. It just made sense from that perspective. Obviously, using Snowflake as our data warehouse, as we talk about the interagency collaborations, there's a lot of chatter now around the data clean rooms and how we can begin sharing data across the agencies in a safe and secure manner. So that's we're now enabled with that. The data lake journey with the AWS services, where we get a full-blown ODS out there up and running is going to be great. So from that perspective, we really wanted to stay as cutting edge as we could with our AWS, services and capabilities. The event-driven architecture that, we're kind of doing in partnership with you all is really going to enable us. We got change data capture capabilities, on the docket to really kind of drive, how fast we can move data, throughout the state when it comes to health information. And really all of this kind of sets us up for the future of a health information exchange, in the state of Virginia, where we can really, empower, how people are treated and serviced across the state.
Thank you. So we have to talk about AI. Don, why don't you reflect on kind of what's ahead with how we could be looking to incorporate artificial intelligence in this solution?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the initial focus had been on how do we get to the data, and then how do we enable the department to start analyzing the data. So AI had not been a real strong focus from the outset. But now I think that the agency is starting to realize that there is a lot of information. There's a lot of very detailed information, and how can they use that? For any of you who are sort of the health tech care standards nerds in the room, like the HL7 structure itself, the evolution into FHIR is continuously changing as well. It's continuing to evolve. And as we start moving into maintenance mode associated with the data warehouse and the ingestion, the integration engine, those things will also need to continue to maintain and keep up with those changes as they occur. And so part of the maintenance and operations process, start of the process of looking at how those changes are evolving, is using AI to help with the coding process to keep pace with those changes. Whether it's from the companion guides, whether it's from the implementation guides, whether it's from the evolving standards themselves, to then say we can automate the addition of fields in the ADT message, we can automate those fields coming from the community service boards, because they're going to review them every year and start looking at what additional information or what changing information are they. So how do we enable AI to support that and speed up the automation process there? The second thing as well that we're also looking at now is, with that unprecedented information, the department can start to become much more proactive of looking at that and saying generation of alerts in the continuum of care, and saying this person has been readmitted. This is the third time in the last 6 months that they've been readmitted. We're seeing that these specific symptoms, these specific triggers, and now we can say we have particular facilities that we can start looking at, proactively saying treatment patterns and things for those individuals can happen because of the sheer amount of information that's available about them and the treatment that's happening. So I think I'm very excited. I hope the department's very excited about now starting to get out in front of these things that are happening. I think that also helps the department start looking at how much do those services cost? Do they have a good understanding of what drivers are behind procedures and diagnosis and state hospitals and services that drive what those costs are going to be or are? And that's are things that they can start predicting out, doing budget forecasting and using AI to start looking at that, of where are the seasonal variations, where are there other things that are driving what some of those particular areas are. So I think it's an exciting world now. We've talked a bit more about how we can use prompts and various things within chat box functions for people who are asking questions about the analytics themselves, the drivers behind the metrics, the number of people that are within it, without having to physically code or drag and drop in semantic layers for BI systems. And I know, Russell, you and I talked a long time ago about how can we start enabling some of these models that have, through these APIs, can create and generate alerts that immediately go out from them, and they can be embedded in any system. It doesn't have to go to the warehouse. The warehouse serves as that function of the data, and then the things that it finds, it can create alerts to other systems. It can send alerts out to care measures or otherwise. And so I think there's a lot of great possibilities that we're just on the cusp of.
Bob, anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm good.
Russell?
One other area that we actually partner with one of the local universities to actually write the curriculum for the course. And there's usually about 6 to 7 students that are in this advanced course. This is our recruiting pipeline. This is how we're bringing in the new talent that we need. And so this semester that just wrapped up, and they just actually presented to us last week, was using agentic AI to actually improve overall metadata as we're bringing data into the data warehouse. So that will be a component that we actually get to keep within the agency. So semester over semester, they get to build new innovative solutions for the agency, and then we get to hopefully hire those very smart young adults into our agency and keep our talent pipeline moving as well. So.
Keep the mic. Let me ask you now to rewind this back to, if you had to go through this journey from the start all over again, what advice would you give for other agencies trying to pull together the right partners, the right resources, the right funding channels to assemble a team to take on such an initiative?
I think that first and foremost, for me, I have a very large network, and it was about bringing in people that wanted to do something different in their careers. And we'd all been at the grind, at Fortune 500 companies. We've been modernizing for decades now. And I kind of joked, with the leaders at the agency that I felt like it was time that I gave back. And so I think it's really around how do you bring in a team of individuals that wants to change something. And so that was, I think I was 2 months into my role. Bob was rolling out some cloud stuff, and I sent him an email and I said, I've got some thoughts. And so he was like, and this was over the Christmas holiday.
And then it began.
And he said, let's meet that first week of January. And it went in, and it felt more like an interview. And so it was really me laying out the vision of kind of what I want to do. So I think in anything that you do, you have to have a vision. Then you have to have people that understand your vision and want to be a part of it, and then people that can actually build a strategy and then go execute on it. And then it's around motivating. I mean, this journey, when we were, building out, what our future architecture was, what our, roadmap for modernizing was, we were, upskilling all of our staff. I mean, we had, within the first 6 months of starting this journey, there were over 60 individuals, that had received numerous AWS certifications. I had never seen anything like that in the private sector. People were excited. For the first time, it was like we were not only building a modernization roadmap, but we were building a career roadmap for people, and individuals of how they were going to advance their careers. And so I think it was just building that energy. And then, as Bob had indicated, we work closely together with our sister agencies, and really everybody is now beginning to see. And these components that we're building, the vision is reusability. We really want to be able to start laying all of this stuff out, so that other agencies can come along and leverage it and begin to move faster, within the state of Virginia.
And I was going to add on just a little bit to that, because you talked about reusability, and one thing that we didn't get too far into earlier was you mentioned Mirth and kind of the integration engine. And part of that process is, of course, you have APIs, the EHRs, they submit in those HL7 messages. Mirth, as an integration engine, processes them and does all the acknowledgments and various things that come out of that process. But the core of that is that it outputs what is the finalized, cleansed message that is going to be stored in an S3 bucket and then made available to DBHDS as the whole for various applications, as well as the data warehouse. And I remember very distinct conversations with Russell of, okay, I may not like Mirth. I know it's a commercial product, like fine, it is what it is. As long as it is encapsulated in its thing and it's API enabled, and that way at any point in time, if I need to, I can replace it with something else, right? I can take constituent parts of this and allow it to be future-proof, so that if things change and evolve over time, I'm not locked into something, that these services, this enablement is going to allow me to evolve and grow and change with this over time, versus the pain of like, oh, I'm locked into this specific tool, or I'm locked into licensing for something, and now I have to keep it that way because that's what it is. And I think that was a really big theme that we worked on when you talked about tools and software and structure and architecture. And I think we've gotten ourselves a pretty good way down that path to keep it as much to that as we can.
Yeah. What other challenges did you hit along the way that others might benefit from navigating in their implementations?
I think a little bit of, at least in my opinion, was some of the unknown. There wasn't a specific template. We had our suggestion, we had our pathway that we were going to move forward with, and sort of working through with Vita of like, where do we set it up? How do we make requests? How do we define the roles that are for those? A lot of that had not really been done at this scale before. And so for DBHDS, for us, for Vita, it was we need to talk about how we do all of those things. And if we're in certain environments, only certain DBHDS architects are going to have access at an administrator level to those things, and our team would not. So then how does the handoff of there's an issue, who do I call, or how do I put in a ticket? And so many of those things had not been defined or decided yet, and we were all learning along the way to get to that. That sort of was what it was. It wasn't necessarily anybody's fault or anything, but it was, we gotta all get on the same page and have lots of conversations around. It's not going to just be us. As more things come, as other projects happen, as other things happen with Vita and with DBHDS, they're going to need these too. So let's establish those patterns now and sort of cement them of how we think they're going to work.
Yep. So what's coming up next, Bob? Why don't you take that? What's ahead for Vita?
Sure. As we talked about earlier, the idea is that we want to create patterns. We want to create different solutions. And, and the way citizens experience state government, they don't experience it through an agency. They experience it as a problem set that they're trying to solve against. And so you look at the challenges that we have, and there are some real challenges out there. And one of the things we're combating right now is the use of opioids, substance abuse. And unfortunately, there's a lot of it out there, And so you look at how do we tackle some of these problems that are really not single agency problems. And what we have found was that there needs to be a structure to provide solutions that can pull in multiple agencies together, because agencies are really good about doing agency missions. I mean, they're optimized for those missions. But when you want to elevate a problem to a higher level and say, we have an issue that's really spanning across multiple agencies, then it becomes a little bit more of a challenging set. And so this is an example of a solution that we've developed separate from DBHDS, even though DBHDS is one of the participating agencies, working with our partners at Deloitte, to build out a substance use disorder and abatement platform. It's called SUDA, but this pulls in data from 10 different agencies. It puts together into different visualizations to understand, and it's designed to really serve the frontline workers that are throughout the state, people that are operating in law enforcement, people operating in behavioral health and social services, and people operating in the localities at all these different levels to give them information to understand what is going on statewide. And so there you're able to see usage around substance use. You're able to understand trends and patterns. It looks at data. Nothing like this exists in the nation. And so we're very, very proud of the work that we're doing. And the thing is about creating solutions like this is that once you've done it, you can do it again, because there are other challenges that are multi-agency challenges. Challenges around workforce development, challenges around education, challenges around permitting, challenges around putting people to work and business development, and all these different things that are critically important, all the things you need to create a state that is the best place to live, work, and raise a family. Those are all the things that citizens really care about. And so they don't care about what agency is doing a particular thing. And so as we look at how to elevate these conversations and elevate these solutions, I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for us to do better. And so using platforms like AWS to kind of serve as that foundational technology, having leaders like Russell here to talk about different ways of doing things differently, to really explore the boundaries of what we're capable of doing and find people that are willing to look at a bigger mission. That's why people come to state government. It's really all about the mission. We care about our neighbors and our friends and the people we live and work with, and we want to do better for them. And so that's what makes state government really, really exciting.
I agree. Thank you. Folks, we've left some time to ask your own questions. For those of you that are also on this journey of innovation, if you have questions, I think we've got a mic set up, or we have a runner here, so please ask away.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you you said earlier that you're bringing in sources not just from different agencies, but also maybe even private practices and things like that. How do you deal with some of the sharing information and the legality of that? How did you navigate the kind of the constraints around sharing data, health data, across different groups?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. It's interesting coming out of the private sector and understanding, all the data rules and regulations. It's magnified at the state level. And so these data clean rooms that I mentioned earlier is one of the areas that we're moving into where, we can really begin to control who has access to what levels of data. That's one aspect. The other things that we are doing is there's a lot of data work in anomalization that's happening across the agency as well, where we've been able to work with the universities once again to introduce noise into data sets to really begin to anomalize the data from that perspective as well. And then that way we've also built out using AWS a data synthetic generator, so we can literally take true data sets and then mock them up in a way where I can completely scrub the data but still leave it in its normal state so you can do analytics on it. So that's another avenue that we've gone down as well to kind of begin to safely share data out across our sister agencies as well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
also, at the point of ingestion, since we have unique submitter IDs based on the Community Service Board, we also have very definitive security roles within the ingestion process to identify who they're aligned to and who they're associated with, because those are the parties that are also allowed to see that particular detail level information. So all of those are also built into all of the downstream processing that's associated with the data, everywhere from the point that it's ingested to the point that it's dropped to the point that it's made available into the synthetic or into the semantic layer, and then as well into the end dashboards that people are able to see. So that community service board can only see their members and who they're aligned to, and then the messages for a certain period of time that go back for them. So there's a lot of role-based access work that goes into that at the message level.
Yeah, and just one of the other things that we didn't touch on here today was through this data warehouse journey, the agency was rolling out data governance. And so while most of you all have probably, rolled this out, in your professional careers, there was no concept of a data owner, or steward, or custodian at the agency. And so data governance was rolled out over the last 2 years as well. And we are now using the the SageMaker Universal Studio to begin building out data dashboards for the data owners to understand not only data quality, but that's going to be the governance mechanism of who they can actually provide access to their data sets as well. So that's just one of the mechanisms that we've done as well.
Just want to add a little bit to it. I do want to assure everybody that the security of data is really important, and so we're regulated by a number of different bodies. There's HIPAA data that's regulated, Health and Human Services data. There's CJIS data, which is criminal justice data, that regulates our law enforcement agencies. There's FERPA data that regulates our educational data. All of these data sources are held at the agency level because they're the ones who best understand the constraints and the requirements of their data. So Russell certainly representing the data at DBHDS, and there are people like Russell at each of the different agencies that hold data. I mean, that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity of how do we create mechanisms to share things safely and securely. So I don't want to give the impression that, hey, we take it all and just kind of throw it into a great big room and that everybody just has that citizen data. That is not the case at all, that this stuff is very, very tightly locked down, sometimes too excessively so, but we take that very seriously. Cybersecurity, data protection is a key mission area of the state because we do hold the role that we have of being custodians of citizen data extremely seriously. So that's part of what we do.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah. I was curious if you have or are using any level of SDOH to determine propensity for service needs?
So we have talked about integration from some additional sources. We do have some externalized, but we have not delved very far into social determinants of health data sets. We've been examining what some of the best ones are in relation to the information that they have now as a wealth of them, especially some of the propensity around supporting more of the demographic information that's not available through the service delivery aspect of the messages. But I think that's something they're starting to bridge now with the Department of what are those externalized sets, where do we pull them down from, how do we curate what they are, how do we link them together with the existing data that they have. So it's part of the journey, it's just, I think it's something that we're starting off on.
Next one's right here.
I just had a quick question about how you've used this system with the implementation of Marcus alerts in Virginia, and how the coordination between the behavioral health data ingestion and the PSAP CAD Center 911 stuff has worked with your guys' system.
What was the second part, I'm sorry? With behavioral health with relation to what?
911 centers.
Oh, 911 centers. Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so you're talking about PSAPs. Those are the call centers that operate, take a 911 call, and those are operated at the locality level. Now, there is an organization, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, that has governance across what we call next generation 911, and that allows interoperability between the various 911 call centers. So if one center goes down, other centers are able to step up. But each one operates in a particular region. They do take the call. They're able to dispatch first responders to that area and provide the citizen with the help that they need in order to secure the safety of all involved. But the data is really held at the locality level. So there is not necessarily a mechanism to merge that data beyond the record. Now, once there is an interaction with the citizen, the patient, they do generate a record. That record does then flow into what we call the Office of EMS. They then take that record to have awareness of what's happening on a statewide basis. So we know within 24 hours every single call that happened in the state. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think right now what we're looking in particular at is that the health event itself could identify somebody who may have come in because they've been unconscious, but I think the tie is what we're trying to get to now around there was a call that was made particularly about that, which had a responder that came then to it, which is the reason why that person ended up in a facility or otherwise with the situation that they're in. So there are some definitive data matching rules that we use in particular to try to completely match those up. I think that's an algorithm that we continue to look at and its efficacy. It's one of the things that Russell had also mentioned of putting out something in front of those data stewards to say these match levels, whether we believe that they're corresponding accurately with the things that we're matching them on, and is that the right level of matching that we're trying to get to. But it is still, I think, an ongoing process around how accurate is that with the data sets that we're trying to match up.
Any other questions from the group?
All right, stunned silence. Yay.
Okay, we'll stick around for a few minutes after in case there are some other follow-ups that you'd all like to have in person. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. And thank you to the panel today.